In New York City, pandemic job losses linger. Even as the country as a whole has recovered all of the jobs it lost during the pandemic, the city is still missing 176,000, the slowest recovery of any major metropolitan area. The amount of international tourists, business travelers, and commuters in New York has yet to return to its pre pandemic level, hurting the workers who serve them. The darkest days of the pandemic are far behind New York City. March has coming off. Times Square is packed with tourists, and Midtown Manhattan lunch spots have growing lines of workers in business suits walking around the city. It often feels like 2019 again. But the bustling surface obscures a lingering wound from the pandemic, while the country as a whole has recently regained all the jobs it lost early in the health crisis. New York City is still missing 176,000, representing the slowest recovery of any major metropolitan area, according to the latest employment data. New York relies more than other countries on international tourists, business travelers, and commuters whose halting return has weighed on the workers who cater to them, from bartenders and baggage handlers to office cleaners and theater ushers. A majority of the lost private sector jobs have been concentrated in the hospitality and retail industries, traditional pipelines into the workforce for younger adults, immigrants, and residents without a college degree. By contrast, overall employment in industries that allow for remote work, such as the technology sector, is back at pre pandemic levels. The lopsided recovery threatens to deepen inequality in a country where apartment rents are soaring, while the number of residents receiving temporary government assistance has jumped by almost a third since February 2020. As New York emerges from the pandemic, city leaders face the risk of an economic rebound that leaves thousands of collar workers behind. The real damage here is that many of the industries with the most accessible jobs are the ones that are still struggling to fully recover, said Jonathan Bowles, the executive director of the Center for an Urban Future, a public policy think tank. New York City was hit particularly hard by the first wave of the virus, prompting business closures and employer vaccine mandates that were among the longest and strictest in the country. Part of the reason for New York's lagging recovery is that it lost a million jobs in the first 2 months of the pandemic, the most of any city. More recently, New York City has regained jobs at a rapid clip. The technology sector actually added jobs in the first 18 months of the pandemic, a period when almost every other industry shrank. But job growth slowed this summer in sectors like hotels and restaurants compared with a year ago, while businesses in technology, healthcare, and finance increased employment at a faster pace over the same period, according to an analysis by James Parrott, an economist at the Center for New York City Affairs in the New School. After being laid off from her restaurant job early in the pandemic, Desire Obando, 35, chose not to return, enrolling instead in community college. In July, the city's unemployment rate was 6.1%, compared with 3.5% in the country overall that month. At the height of the pandemic, Rona Knives, 47, was laid off as a cleaner at an office building in Midtown Manhattan, while he had worked for 7 years. Mr. Knight, his girlfriend, and his 2 children struggled on unemployment benefits and food stamps. He secured temporary positions, but the work was spotty with few people back in offices. He didn't want to switch careers, hoping to win his old position back. He began to drink heavily to deal with the anxiety of unemployment. In May, his building finally called him back to work. When I got the phone call, I wanted to cry, Mr. Knight said. There are 1,250 fewer office cleaners in the city now than there were before the pandemic, according to Local 32 BJ of the Service Employees International Union. Last month, New York officials cut their jobs growth forecast for 2022 to 4.3% from 4.9%, saying the state was not expected to reach pre-pandemic levels of employment until 2026. Officials cite the persistence of remote work and the migration of city residents away from the state as a long-term risk to employment levels. The number of tourists visiting New York City this year is expected to rebound to 85% of the level in 2019, a year in which a record 66.6 million travelers arrived, according to forecasts from New York City and Company, the city's official tourism agency. However, according to the agency, visitors to the city are spending less money overall because those who have historically stayed longer, business and international travelers, have not returned at the same rate. This hurt department stores that depend on high-spending foreign visitors, as well as hotels that rely on business travelers to book conferences and banquets. Lee Sanders, 47, returned to a job as a room attendant this month at the Paramount Hotel in Times Square, which is reopening for the first time since March 2020. The hotel had been candidate to be converted into affordable housing, but the plan was opposed by a local union, the New York Hotel and Gaming Trades Council, in order to save jobs. Mrs. Santos said she could not find any employment for 2 years, falling behind every month on her bills. The hotel union provided a $1,000 payment to a landlord to help cover her rent. I'm excited to be going back to work, getting back to my normal life and becoming more stable, Mrs. Santos said. Despite the city's elevated unemployment rate, many employers say they are still struggling to find workers, especially in roles that cannot be done remotely. The size of the workforce has also dropped, declining by about 300,000 people since February 2020. The number of tourists visiting New York City in 2022 is expected to rebound to 85% of the level in 2019, a year in which a record 66.6 million travelers came to the city. Some blue-collar employees who lost their jobs early in the pandemic are now holding out for positions that would allow them to work from home. Jade Campbell, 34, has been out of work since March 2020, when the pandemic temporarily shuttered the Old Navy store where she had worked as a sales associate. When the store called her back in the fall, she was in the middle of a difficult pregnancy with a first-grade son who was struggling to focus during online classes. She decided to stay home, applying for different types of government assistance. Mrs. Campbell now lives on her own in Queens without child care support. Her children are 1 and 8 years old. She has refused to get vaccinated against COVID-19, a prerequisite in New York City for many in-person jobs. Still, she said she feels optimistic about applying for remote customer service roles after she reached out to Good News New York NYNJ, a nonprofit, for help with her resume. I got 2 kids I know I have to support, she said. I can't really depend on the government to help me out. At Percy Plumbing, heating in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, several workers quit over the city's policy that employees of private businesses be fully vaccinated. The restriction was the most stringent in the country when it was announced in December 2021 at the end of Mayor Bill de Blasio's term. After Mayor Eric Adams signaled earlier this year that his administration would not enforce the mandate, Michael Percy, the company's owner, offered to rehire three former workers. One returned, another had found another job, and the third had moved to another state. He said, thanks to a $50 hourly wage and monthly bonuses, current job opening at Batchy Plumbing have attracted a flood of applicants in a shift from before the pandemic. Mr. Purchase said he now has to wade through more applicants with no plumbing experience. The strongest candidates often have too many driving infractions to be put on a company's insurance policy, he said, but recently, Mr. Purchase was so desperate to hire a mechanic with too many infractions that he recruited a young worker just to drive him.